Rio, we are already talking about our topics, so we might as well just start.
Excellent.
The Max and Ian interview is on the main plate for today, and just kind of going through the things that they talked about, almost in order. They started off by addressing the difficulty of the raids and kind of community perception versus what was some needed changes, right? I'm interested in how you think now that we've had our our second Nathria week now, but we have yet to see our second Sod week. What did you think
Right.
of that second
For
Nathria week?
for the faded stuff. Second Nathria week overall felt much better. We still didn't get Sire down. I'm 50-50 on whether we could have if we wanted to and tried to, but we kind of didn't really attempt it. We're just kind of like, we'll kick the bucket down the road and do it next week kind of thing. Or next, whatever, 3 weeks from now. Um, I think overall they landed in a better place after their tweaks. I think the first like 5% HP nerf change, if I remember right, I was basically advocating for that change, and then like as we hit end recording on the podcast, they announced like, by the way, we're nerfing all the bosses by 5%. Like, oh thanks, cool. Um, so I agree with that in case that wasn't obvious. But I think also the additional like what creation spark change nerf thing that went in, I still think some more might need to be done with that. That was particularly hard on Lehuvum, and what it was last week or last Sepulchre Faded week was Jailer and a couple other fights like that. So I think depending on how it rotates on certain bosses, that'll also continue to be an issue. So they'll probably have to continue looking at that and make some more changes with that. But other than that, I think it's mostly fine for most of the other affixes and on all the bosses pretty much. So
Yeah, I think the biggest difference that we saw was how a different affix on a given boss can make it so much easier. Like most notably, Nerva Darkfane, where you are now just AoEing ads, which people love to do. Like that's, I think, arguably a lot of people's favorite affix. Obviously, it differs, but um,
aside from the lag, but yes.
aside from the lag, but that as opposed to having to catch soaks in a fight that already has bottles being thrown out that you need to soak, um, and then you
I
have
I
yeah, go
don't
ahead.
mind the catching part as much though. It's more so just the weird like debuff timer interaction like wonkiness that it's like there's not really an intuitive way of how it will affect everything. That's the more annoying part. I don't mind having to like run around and stand in a circle for 2 seconds kind of thing. That doesn't bother me as much, but the problem is it's not coming with a ton of upside, and it's also coming with some downside a lot of time. Rather than most of the other ones, which are just like, here's you get to have fun pressing AoE buttons, and then you do like 40% more damage for this boss, and it's just like, great, this is only upside aside from the lag. But yeah,
It's interesting because it also. So I definitely agree with you. Like Jailer, Mythic Jailer was incredibly difficult with the buff from that, and the fact that your bomb would go off at a different time than necessarily your weak aura if your weak aura wasn't built off of the actual timing of the buff expiring and all that. Um, just that whole concept was frustrating. But then you think about another fight like SLG, where actually being in a particular position can be difficult. So like if you happen to have dispel go off when you got the eruptions following you where the group splits into two, right?
right.
um that's incredibly difficult. So like it's certain fights that makes that harder. So Sire P3 with dispels, that's frustrating as well, especially if some
Yeah,
go into a pie slice that's already down on the ground. It's a two-part affix almost, um, relative to a lot of the other ones. So, but besides the add one that gives you lag, right? But
yep.
um, I don't know. I think it'll be interesting to see this next rotation, kind of see what bosses have what that make things easier. Knowing all of this and having our skips available, do we choose to just avoid a particular boss because we know it's going to be super difficult ahead of time, and then almost backtrack to it the way some other guilds were approaching it with Sire, because that's what a lot of the groups did. I think they cleared 1 through 9, um, or they did their skip, went and did the rest of the bosses, and then went to Sire after that. I think that was
Mm.
an arguably good approach. Um,
Yeah,
but our priorities being different, um, us prioritizing our heroic for dinars for everybody, just to make sure everybody gets theirs. Um, doing our mythic and then into our rough mount clear. So all those things, right?
yeah.
Um,
I think Sanctum will be interesting to see this coming week.
yeah, absolutely. And the gear, the difference in gear has helped significantly alongside
Yes,
their nerfs. I very much like how it's played out. Um,
and still think we have like another decent bit way to go on gear. Also, like I think most people are probably hitting around like 295 to 298, 299 ish range right now. Like maybe low single digit, 300. Where I think by the end of the tier, we'll be up around like 308, 309, 310 ish range. So I think we still have another 5 to 10 eye levels to go, which will definitely be felt. Like I know for me this week, for example, I finally got my weapon that I purchased from the dinar because we had enough mythic tokens and stuff like that. So once people start getting more mythic tokens, then they can get not only their weapon but um, their two bis trinkets and some other special item like the Mechagon rings or a cloak or whatever.
yeah, and speaking of dinar, that's one of the items that they talked about how they liked the concept of it, but if it were slowed over the course of a season, so right now the whole goal is for us to get these items super fast so we can actually experience them in the season before it
Mm-hmm.
ends. I really like that concept where, you know, provided we have a tier that's more like Sanctum in terms of uh, ability to reclear, where we've killed
Right.
Sylvanas over 10 times, something like that, right? That
Yep.
that concept that, that's a lot of times to be killing Kel'Thuzad and not get Jaethys, or to be killing Sylvanas and not get your bow, whatever it may be, right? So I would like for them this concept of implementing it, even if it's just for one item as opposed to three, I think would be really interesting. If they make it only for one or like a smaller number, one or two, it would intensify the decision
Mm.
for a lot of people. But I'm not against it. Whether it's a dinar system, whether it's some other form of RNG protection, I'm down for it. And sounds like they
Yeah.
might be too.
I think three is a pretty good number personally. I could maybe see going down to two. One definitely doesn't feel like enough to me. Um, two I could maybe be okay with. I think the more important thing is I think three feels about right. I agree that in a normal quote unquote season, you don't want to have it where like I have the Mythic Sylvanas bow and I have yet to kill Mythic Sylvanas. Like that just kind of feels weird. Um, so rather than them being very upfront and like lopsided to the start of the season, having them be more gradual and you get one after 2 months of the season and another one after 4 months of the season, or and another one like 6 months into the season or something like that, where it's a more gradual, even rate of acquiring them, and they're kind of maybe they're not quite as even, but even if they're backloaded, where for example you have to get CE first before you can, and then you can start acquiring them or something, and then you acquire them at a similar kind of rapid pace as now, but it's just backloaded instead of front loaded kind of thing. I think something like that would be better. But yeah, it seems like they heard our feedback that currently you can't really target an item that you're missing. You can be doing everything correct and still not get it, and you can't possibly do anything more. And some protection for the worst RNG cases that just they're not fun to exist in the first place. They serve no real purpose. They just make people frustrated for no reason. Um, I'm glad that they heard that feedback and that they're thinking about good ways to change that, both in the context of season four and in a quote unquote more regular season. So
Yeah, and can't really talk about dinar without also talking about the cipher system, which I think is pretty cool. Um, I like the concept because dinar, you'll purchase it at normal level and then you can
right,
upgrade it essentially, right? But and so they very much fall hand in hand. But you also have the ability that beyond the dinar, maybe you purchase your third piece coming up here in this next week or whatever, and you then have another piece that you got that was normal or heroic, and over the course of the season, you'll also work towards upgrading that one. Um, I think it's a good system. I think the only gripe I have about the ciphers is the gap between the guilds that performed well in the first couple weeks
Hmm.
is very, very easily seen. And on top of that, like if you have a larger roster and can't have everybody in for the boss, like in our
Yes.
scenario with many, many healers, our healers have very, very low cipher counts, which I mean, it's a thing. They also made it so you could like practically three heal all the bosses in Nathria if you wanted to this week, which we didn't end up doing, but you definitely could have. It just poses that comment of it's like, well, people that are clearing more are getting more gear, but they're also not the ones that are needing it. So one of
Right.
the conversations I had with a guild
It's
member
like a
was,
win more system kind of thing for the
yeah,
guilds that are already being successful just get more rewards when it's like they're already getting more rewards. Why did they need even more on top of that? Yeah. Go
right,
ahead. You
and
had
what
a conversation.
yeah, so a conversation I had with a guild member was like, how do you make that system better? And one of the things I thought about was you have to make a system that works for all the different tiers of players that you got, right? Because you've got the people that are only clearing normal,
Hmm.
friends and family that they reference. You got people that are clearing heroic AOTC guilds, and you've also got CE guilds, and there's a big gap between that, right? Guilds that only clear a
Yes.
certain number of bosses in a given raid, but that's the thing is, if you think about CE guilds or guilds that are getting CE right at the end of the tier, something like that, they're barely going to see any benefit at all from uh, the concept of a cipher system for that given tier. What if clearing heroic bosses gave you mythic ciphers?
Like full clearing the raid on heroic. I think just killing like the heroic end boss maybe would be enough. Or just the
Yeah,
skip bosses or something. I don't think full clearing heroic seems kind of excessive. But
yeah, yeah. But the concept being that if you're an AOTC guild, more likely than not, even the guilds like halfway through, they get geared um through Mythic Plus. It's not like they're incredibly
right.
undergeared relative to the Mythic guilds and such. I think it's honestly just what each player's individually capable of. And it would be fun for them to at least be able to access those pieces of gear. And I don't like I would be shocked if you ever had somebody that was clearing Mythic, getting CE and all that stuff, and they got their Jathis, but they also saw somebody in Heroic have a Mythic Jathis and be frustrated about that for whatever reason, right? Like I think that would be a bit misplaced. Um,
Well, and that can already happen in the current system kind of anyway. Um I think a lot of this uh, one problem is a lot of this stuff ties together, and we'll talk about more of some of this later on with stuff of like the Mythic Plus reward system and a lot of the what you were saying of like having a certain roster and not be in on certain Mythic bosses is kind of coming back to the lockout problem, which I think we're going to touch on now. But specifically to your suggestion, I like that suggestion. One thing I was going to mention is right now, for example, in my bags, I have two heroic upgrade tokens. But the problem is I have no items that I actually want to upgrade to the heroic item level. I either already have them at heroic item level or higher or mythic, or I don't have the item yet. So there's like a weird disconnect in the system where like I'm getting too much of one currency and not enough of a different currency so that I have the currency just sitting there that even though I would want to spend it, I haven't yet gotten the ability to spend it on anything that's actually useful to me. So some better system where you could turn in, for example, 3 heroic tokens and turn them into a mythic token or something like that is also maybe a good idea for a system. It's kind of similar to what you're saying where you can do something in heroic to give you a little bit of a foothold into mythic or um like an on ramping into mythic where you can kind of bump yourself a little bit up above the heroic level. I think that's just a good idea in general to try and turn the AOTC guilds into you know early to mid clearing mythic boss guilds. Maybe they're not quite CE guilds, but I think bridging those kind of gaps in the social structure of the community in terms of like rating and things like that. I think that's a good idea. I think once people kind of get a foothold in Mythic, and they see what those bosses are like, then they might see, oh, well, this season I only cleared 3 or 4 bosses on Mythic, but next season I want to clear 5 or 6. And then it drives them to improve a bit better. It makes them, I think breaks down a lot of the barriers where it's like, there's the CE race to world first raiders, and they're like the elitist, like, scum that, like, don't want to help casual gamers at all. And we're like the AOTC gamers, and we're just casual here, and we don't like that the CE raiders are always ruining stuff for us. But it's like, in reality, we're on the same team, and those people, they see each other as different, but in reality, they're like so identically close to each other. It's hilarious when you actually understand it. And yeah, bridging that gap where you can see, like, oh, the mythic people in mythic guilds, they're not like these elitist people or whatever. They're just regular people. Like, they like the same game as you, even. They like doing the same thing in the game as you. And they're just a bit better at it and in a better group about it. But you're a lot closer to them than you probably think, that type of. So
A
I
two
think that
press
would
aim
be.
shot.
I think that would be a good for the social benefit of the game, as well as just like the actual, like, I'm DPS brain. I want my character to be more powerful. Give me DPS highly mythic item level weapon, please. Thank. So
Yeah.
I think there's benefits on both sides.
Well, you started to allude to it already, this concept of mythic lockouts, and they definitely touched on that in the interview where, they view it as healthy friction. They they've pretty much laid down that they are of the opinion that clearing mythic raids is something that should largely be handled in a guild group, essentially. That pugs, like later in the season, you can pug the earlier bosses more reasonably, but they kind of don't want it to expand beyond that necessarily. They view it as that higher tier loot for a reason, especially those ladder bosses towards the end of a raid that, um, in this case, give 311 gear. They kind of want it to be that way. This is a unique season to be looking at that. I think we have to look
Mm-hmm.
at it through the lens of previous seasons.
Right.
Um, because I definitely experienced that when I very first started raiding. I played in Nyalotha, and the concept of mythic pugging uh, in Nyalotha was interesting because in the first three bosses, two of them were really really easy, and one was incredibly difficult.
Hmm.
If I ever got into a pug that managed to kill the third boss, I felt like I was a god among men, honestly. But um, I don't know. I about the mythic lockouts. I hear them. I definitely still think the the topic of the podcast, extended lockout,
Yeah.
is something that should be addressed. This concept that you want to keep extending it and not be able to see any form of loot in the meantime, and like budgeting your time with a given raid week, that feels like a problem because that's what a lot of guilds experience. But I also understand their view that there doesn't need to be content that's for everybody.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I agree with parts of this, and I staunchly disagree with other parts of it. Um, I do think, and part of this will come back to the Mythic Plus, like, loot and the rewards from that and everything else. I think Ian mentioned in the interview, they're looking at sort of restructuring the difficulty level and rewards level of each of these things. So for example, right now, he said if you're an AOTC guild, like, you might not be, you might be 9 out of 10 and you haven't quite gotten AOTC yet. But you're at the point where you're raiding heroic every week, but you don't actually need any of the gear in heroic anymore because you've been doing plus 15, which are seen as kind of like, I would say, the mythic level of mythic plus in terms of rating. They're the mythic rating equivalent, is doing your weekly 15s or whatever. Um, but because those are probably easy enough where some AOTC level players can do it, that they are, like, they're making the content that they're actually doing not give a equivalent level of reward for the effort that they're putting in or whatever, for example. So basically rebalancing the nature of what is a plus 15 level in terms of AOTC, or a CE or a mythic level player, and maybe a plus 10 should be rebalanced to be where the AOTC player is expected to get in Mythic Plus, and plus 15s become harder or something. But then it also means that they can give those more rewards, for example. Or the opposite, where it could be Heroic is too hard, for example, compared to plus 15s, and so Heroic needs to become easier so that it's almost a pathway into doing higher level Mythic Plus or something like that. I don't know, but whatever. They're gonna discuss all that, I think. Um, I think the restrictions of mythic lockouts for social friction does make sense, but the problem is he also said in the same breath, I think I tweeted this earlier, which I didn't want to spoil you on, but I'm not sure if you got spoiled on or not. Was that the difficulty of mythic isn't meant for pugs in the first place, so making lockouts that benefit pugs from not breaking up kind of feels like, well, they're not supposed to be in that difficulty in the first place. So of course they're going to break up. Like, that's, you designed it that way. They're not meant to be there. Um, and the actual problem is, sure, it makes pugs stick together more often, but the problem is those pugs are in pugs. When you want those pug players to actually be joining guilds, and currently they can't join guilds because they're having to join a guild group, which is, already on boss 5, and they don't want loot from only boss 5. They would rather pug bosses 1 through 3 or 1 through 4 when the guilds are on bosses 5 and 6, but they're extending by that point and all these other things. So I think it would make more sense to me as a player that you're catering the difficulty that's built for guilds and organized group play to foster people into getting into organized groups and out of the pug groups, because once you're in the pug kind of world, it's very hard to leave that, I feel like, unless you get kind of like yanked in by a friend of yours that's already in a guild or something like that. It's kind of a hard social wall that gets built up where you feel like a guild is kind of like a separation layer where it's a barrier that people don't get past. They either stay on the pug side or they get on the guild side, and then they never go back to the pug side. But there's not a lot of crossover from one happening into the other. It's a very slow kind of process, and just the separation between the two kind of creates a, a layer of separation. And so I think that would be a good idea to do it. A suggestion I heard, for example, was lockouts could work similar to the LFR wings, where you're only, if you join on boss 2, Skolex or whatever, that you're maybe locking yourself out of getting loot from Vigilant Guardian and, Desegni or whatever. But you're only locking yourself to that wing, like those 3 bosses, that collection of bosses, and then you're still able to get loot and join other lockouts for Anduin, Raglan, Lords of Dread, or for Lehuvum, Pantheon, and Halandras, and different wings of bosses, collections of like 3 or 4 bosses. Something like that. I feel like that's a good compromise, kind of, that it's like a pug is still incentivized to stick together for the 3 bosses that the pug is made up with, but realistically, is a pug lasting in Mythic longer than 3 bosses? Like, what percentage of pugs realistically last past that point? Probably like less than 2% or something, less than 1%. And so having a clear checkpoint where you can say, all right, we made it this far. Now we can break up as pugs and not have to be in here for 8 hours a day. Like, we did our 3-hour pug raid, we killed 3 bosses. Okay, cool. Now we can break up, and now we can go back to our guild, and we can still progress with our guild, but at least we got loot from these 3 bosses, even though we're extending. Like, all these different things. So I had a lot to say there. Sorry, I didn't want to dominate the conversation that much. I want you to chime in at some point, but yeah, that's kind of where my thoughts are at, basically.
No, I definitely agree. I think that the wings idea is a great system. They already do it for LFR, not that LFR is a system to really
Yeah,
put
it's
in.
kind of ironic that Mythic is going to be inspired by LFR. But hey, if it works and it's a good solution, why not?
Yeah, I honestly think that would be a really, really good idea. I'd personally want to see a season where that is the case and kind of build my opinions off of that. But also, when you mention it, the concept of a pug, like I tried to do that somewhat recently. I tried going into a pug on my Resto Druid, and I was interested, like, well, how does a pug handle Skolex? And I didn't really care too much for the loot, just kind of wanted to experience it. So I
Right.
joined a group that was on Skolex, so they killed Vigilant. I wasn't getting any loot there, and I very quickly realized it is just so much of a trap that you lock yourself and you find out in that first pull, is this pug gonna kill this boss?
Right.
Probably not, and
Well,
then you are
yeah,
bricked
it's
for the
also a
week.
weird thing where on Mythic, you're locking yourself before you even get to pull the boss a single time. Like, it's not like you lock yourself only after you've killed the boss, which is how, like, heroic lockouts work and stuff. You lock yourself, like, on zoning in. And so it's creates this weird toxic culture of people not getting invited to groups in the first place if their item level is too low, and it creates the whole like link CE to get invited to my Mythic Skull X pug and like all those different things. So it's like all these social issues are kind of symptoms of some of these core fundamental systemic problems of how lockouts work and stuff like that. That I feel like so much so many barriers would be lowered so much further down, and they would be so much more achievable for people to get over each. Having some barriers is inevitable to some extent. Like, you are doing harder content, there is a little bit of a barrier that people need to get over. It's going to uh gatekeep is probably the bad word, but it has negative connotations. But to some extent, gatekeep some people out of being able to do that content. Like it's unavoidable to some extent. Where if you're making the content more difficult, like it's going to do that to some people. But making them those barriers as achievable as possible to overcome. I don't know if there's a better way to phrase that, but um, yeah, I think is a good thing, and it'll help like not making the player base fight against itself when they're wanting to work together to do the goal together. Like eliminating those weird, like contradictory, contrasting, like fighting ideas, uh, is a good thing. I think if it's possible, and this seems like a clear place where it's probably possible in some way. Maybe our suggestions aren't the exact perfect way to do it that Blizzard agrees with, but I think something in here could be figured out that's better than the current system at least. So
Yeah, I agree. And speaking of tearing down barriers, I think you can combine a whole bunch of points right here. They say that cross realm is going to be a thing next patch earlier, kind of the way it was for season 4. Um, or actually season 3 itself, right? That we saw
mhm.
earlier. Cross realm, cross server guilds are something that they're considering a little bit down the line. Maybe not right from the start. Cross faction. The issues they announced are confirmed to be bugs. It's not like you're not allowed to just whisper an alliance player, which is the case for a lot of horde players. And
Yep.
then they also say cross faction guilds are a thing that they want to do. They said the goal of before next expansion, and I was listening back to that a couple times. I was like, well, does that mean before Dragonflight or does that mean before 11.0? Like,
Yeah, I think
I,
that means
I actually
before
don't know.
11.0.
I would assume. Um, but yeah,
Which to me that answer was kind of disappointing because I was hoping it was closer to like before the first patch of Dragonflight or like with the first patch of Dragonflight. That was kind of like the latest that I was like hoping for. And so next expansion is like, oh, that's a lot further away than I hoped. Yikes. And I understand that it's probably difficult to some extent with like just server infrastructure and like the way that the game was built from the ground up kind of thing around this. And it's probably much more difficult than I imagine. I completely understand that. However, I do think and you can call me out, disagree with me if I'm wrong here. I think cross faction guilds is probably like the number one most important feature going into Dragonflight that I think they could do.
just because
Like
you said
more
cross faction. Is that what you said?
cross faction guilds,
Yeah.
yeah, not
Okay.
the server part yet, just the cross faction part. And so I feel like if it's like something where it is that difficult, I feel like it should be such a priority that it's like it's all they focus on to a similar extent as like converting the modern client down to like have classic WoW be a possibility. Like it's on that level of like so fundamental to the way the game should work that I just feel like it has to be like the highest priority. And so if it means like we don't get a mage tower or we don't get, a backpack slot update in the expansion or like whatever, weird other thing that they can do with that tech time, I feel like it's such a priority that they should just focus as much time as possible onto that. Um and that's like my number one most requested thing above almost anything else in Dragonflight is getting cross faction guilds to be a thing like as soon as possible. I don't want to wait until next extension. If that's not possible, I guess I'll accept it. Like I what else am I going to do? But man, I really wish it was on a much sooner timescale than that. And I don't know if it's because they're not putting it at that same priority and they think of it as kind of a luxury thing. Whereas I'm trying to get the point across that my feedback is like, no, this is like super, 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 super important. Um, yeah, curious how you feel about that.
I I think that's funny that it's coming from a hunter who has their talent tree iterated upon very, very frequently. So I would understand why that's now your new top priority. But can I really be speaking as a shaman? I don't know. But um, I do think it's important. I think from
I think there's
a
different people working on both of those things
yeah,
for what it's worth.
well, from an officer perspective, yeah, any way that you can tear down barriers to allow some players to play with others, that's all a good thing. I would very much want to see that. So I'm on board with you. I don't know where it should fall on a priority list, but I know that there's a lot of bugs, but they were comfortable shipping this concept of cross faction, even outside of rating, and there were still bugs. And I think everyone would agree we'd rather have it with bugs than
Yes.
without.
Yes.
That's kind
Well,
of
and
yeah.
for example, I'm aware that on private servers they've already accomplished this. So like it's probably not that hard, right? Like that's kind of where I'm coming from. Now maybe they just like super jank like stitched it together with duct tape and like it has tons of bugs on the back end that they have to constantly manually fix and Blizzard doesn't want that. Like that's probably realistically the case based on a lot of private servers. However, it was still possible where they still did the undertaking of doing it in the first place. It wasn't like so insurmountable that they just gave up and they didn't do it at all, kind of thing. And so, like you're saying, I would much rather have it be in whatever barely working way that it functions and with some bugs. That's fine. I can accept the bugs if that means we get the functionality, the core functionality of it, like a patch or two sooner than rather than waiting all the way until next expansion. So,
Yeah, will be interesting to see, but I like the fact that they're looking for cross everything going forward. Want to see those being implemented. I think if 11.0 comes out and that stuff isn't implemented, you're gonna have some angry people. But I guess we could kind of move on to the raid buff and raid composition aspect of the interview. So one of the things I touched on was they like raid buffs, but kind of they want you to try to have one of each class because they view that as a bit better than just bringing as many of one meta spec as you can. And I get that. Um, they also view it as that you could have some form of like a scroll returning, and I think a good example is you've got Arms Warrior, or I'm sorry, not Arms Warrior, but just Warrior in general, or their Battle Shout. If you give a scroll that gives, like a weaker form of a Battle Shout, at what point is the appropriate tuning for that where you still feel comfortable enough to not go with a Warrior, that you could just use a scroll, but also as a Warrior feel valuable enough to the raid? And I mean, that's an odd example because of Rally and all that, but this concept that you want to bring one of each class, I think is a cool concept. I think
yeah.
playing it out is not very realistic. I think you've Max touched on it. This concept that heroic guilds don't have one of everything, nor is it entirely reasonable for them to do that. Actually, more often than not, you'll have people in heroic guilds class swap to try to achieve that. That's how important it is to certain people, and we'll touch on that later. But I'm interested in what you thought about their view of raid buffs.
Um, yeah, I like the ideal of like you should want to have one of each class in a 20-person mythic raid or whatever. I think that's a good goal. Um, I do think to some extent though, if you have, for example, 11 or 12 and you're only missing like one or two, it shouldn't probably be as punishing as it is compared to like losing almost, 5% damage on the boss or whatever. It's not quite as strictly straightforward as that in terms of math, but something to that extent where it's such a large impact on your output and throughput on the boss as a group. If you're only missing one or two, so I feel like some way where you could do a scroll, but the scroll like you're only able to have one scroll active or something, so you can only get one buff of a class not in your group, where you basically only need to bring 12 or something like that would be a good
Boy,
compromise. I don't want to have a scroll for every buff though and have, for example in Mythic Plus, I'm scrolling 6 different buffs plus the 5 that my group has or whatever. I don't want that to be the scenario. So I think limiting the amount of consumables that you're actually using would be a good idea. So that's why I want to probably limit it to just one like scroll buff or something. Um, yeah.
yeah,
Currently, there's issues with some classes not having those things yet. Obviously, Hunter, Shaman, and I think DK are the main three that people are thinking of. Um, and yeah, I think those will probably get figured out over the course of Dragonflight Alpha Beta, and they're just not there yet. But I'm waiting patiently. So yeah,
I can just imagine the guilds arguing over what's more important, the physical damage debuff or the magic damage debuff.
yeah.
When they haven't even
Maybe two
split.
is a better
Yeah.
a better limit than one.
Who
Yeah.
knows? And approaching that is his own
Or
problem. But
maybe it can scale with group size. Like for example, if you're doing a 10-man raid, you have like 3 or 4 scrolls available to you, Whereas if you're doing a 20-person raid, it's like 2 scrolls, and if you have a 30-person raid, you get like 1 scroll. Something like that. Where depending on the size of your group comp in like the flex raid whatever difficulties, like you have a different amount that you're able to do.
Yeah. It,
That's kind of a weird like game systemy way of handling it, but I mean, whatever. Sometimes you can't really avoid those. So
my view is they have a different perspective than before. I kind of want to see how it plays out a little bit before I really define my opinions. Like, I like your concept that you said, but I kind of want to see what they do first before I really judge it, you know?
yeah,
Um, but they also touch on the bloodlust that evokers are going to get. They touch on the battle res that most likely paladins are to receive. I think that's kind of cool. If you've ever raided in a heroic group and you're like, oh, battle res this guy, and it's like, oh, we don't have any battle res classes. Let's hope somebody's engineering, or like you're forming dungeon groups around whether or not you have a bloodlust because drums is just not enough type of thing, right? So
yep.
that's the one caveat I would say is this concept of something weaker but still works. Is it like, does it really still work? Because using drums and keys is cool and all, but it's not the same, right? I like that it's a nerfed version, but maybe the gap between the two feels too big. Maybe it's just uh conceptually feels too big, but it's not actually, right? Like, I'm not too sure where I stand there. I kind of want to just see more data, more changes as we go into Dragonflight before I really judge.
This is my hot take as a DPS player, so maybe it's hilariously wrong, and we can laugh at me as we do. Uh, that's why Oots is here, of course, to provide the non-stupid DPS brain opinion on this stuff. Um, I think every healer spec should be able to battle res. I don't see why not. It just seems like a pointless, needless restriction at this point.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'm not super against it. I like the concept that I think it would be that on top of what we currently have because
Okay, here's an interesting idea. Is what if it was a talent that you had to talent into as a healer in
I
like your tree?
I would think that'd be a really good thing personally. Um, I think it depends on the healer. Like, there are some that are really trying to loosen their belt because they have their exact kit built out, right? So in certain
Mhm.
scenarios, that would be worse for some healers than others, but that's just the nature of the talent trees. I like the concept that you have, though. I would rather see that implemented than not, personally. But I also understand their view that they want you to. Well, that's how you bring druids to keys now, right? Is a battle res. I don't know.
Yeah, that feels like such a bad way to balance bringing a class to keys or something, though.
Yeah.
I and
Well,
it's just annoying in raid where you're like, okay, we have the druid assigned to be the leading, edge on the jailer like blood soaks, but then the person who dies is on the trailing blood soaks, and you don't have a DK in the raid because that doesn't bring a raid buff, right? So you don't need them, and then that's the only, and your soulstone is already on a healer, so you can't use it to battle res. And then, or what if that healer has to take the battle res mid pull to like keep the pull going, but then you don't have it as wipe recovery? Like, it's just so awkward. Where it's just like, if there's a healer in range of me and I die and we have a battle res, just get me up off the ground. Like, that should be the end of the thought process, right? Is like, it's so annoying where you have to be like, oh, the melee DK player has to run off the boss to the trailing group so that he can res me because the healer's on the leading group. Like, why is that a thing? Just let any healer be able to do it. It costs them like their GCD or whatever their cast time is for the res, but like, and some healers can be better at doing it than others, right? Like some healers have the instant cast like battle res thing or something, or they like swift casted or whatever, swift mended or something. I forget what the exact nature swiftness is. That what it is?
Yep,
I'm
yep, you
getting there
got it. You
eventually.
got
Okay.
it. Let's go.
um, and yeah. So like certain healers could probably be more efficient at it than others, or like it costs less mana for them or something than others, and like it still maybe is like better to assign a certain class to be the first person to do it if they're available or something like that because it's more efficient for healer mana. I don't know. There could be a way to balance it if you really want to keep the healers a little bit different in that aspect, but like they all should just be able to do it rather than you having to have those weird scenarios, I feel like. So,
Yeah, and I already understand the whole semi argument where I was saying, say you bring druids, it's like, okay, yes, every key player is engineering, and you've got Blood DK as like the main tank going on right now. So yeah, you've got battle resonances,
yeah, that's
but outside of it, just a very um, wide scope approach to it. I'm trying to say, but
yeah.
um, beyond that, there's some that are hard to quantify, like a Death Knight, Death Grip they touched on, where if you just think to yourself for a second about how you approach Soul Render
Mhm.
and I'm not talking about Soul Render farm. I'm talking about Soul Render progression where say you have 1 DK, and so your first grouping works really well, but then after that, it's kind of like, well, let's go have our Elemental Shaman go knock those back, and running forces and all these things to kind of group them together. I like that concept, but it's also like that changes the fight so drastically that a guild that's progressing with a Death Knight has way easier time killing that boss more than just like some of the other buffs of Battle Shout or of the magic debuff from Chaos Brand, right? So uh, it's an odd approach, but it's also that particular boss and their raid design team, like all that kind of factors in. But on top of that, they kind of said that they liked the concept of Death Grip. They liked the idea that a class has such a unique niche role in the raid, they kind of want to try to emulate that going forward for other classes. Now, let's be honest, I don't think there's any way you could find anything close to Death Grip in terms of how unique it is, right? And actually implement that comfortably for a class where you feel that same way about that, with a couple of exceptions that are already out in the game. I'm talking about if they're developing new ones, right?
Right. Yeah, it's definitely hard for them to develop. Um, I I don't have much issue with this answer because like, yeah, Death Grip is cool. It does feel really bad when you don't have a DK though, and you really need one. So like, some other way where you wouldn't be as reliant on having a DK would be nice, but like, but then Death Grip doesn't feel as cool maybe. But also as a DK player, do a lot of them really like being the guy that has to grip things all the time instead of just being able to like DPS? I'm not certain that's true. Seemed like a lot of them liked A-Bomb Limb, for example, because it meant that they didn't have to manually grip things all the time as much. Um, and even then, A-Bomb Limb was its own weird finicky on certain fights and required, running off the boss and turning your character in certain directions and all those type of things. So I'm not sure that even the DKs like it in the current way that it is, and so maybe it's just better that you weren't so reliant on it. Yeah, I'm not really sure on this one. And like you said, I think it'll be hard for them to come up with similar things for other classes. But
Yeah. And with that said, speaking of DKs kind of melee, they've done a good job of melee representation. That was one of the things they touched on, is it feels a lot more comfortable bring a melee in Sanctum or in Sepulchre than it um did in other raids in the past. It's kind of weird because that's largely what my raiding experience is based off of. So like I understand the benefit of range and all that, but seeing more and more fights where, it's okay to be melee is
yep,
kind of funny. And we're going to Dragonflight. We're looking at a roster that could have more melee than ranged, and that's not that bad. We have to kind of see the fights first, but like it doesn't have to feel all that bad. Um,
something that I would be. First of all, yes, I agree. This is an awesome change in general. I don't really play melee that often, but uh, it also is weird when you're like, this guy would be really good on this fight. He's one of our best players, and because we already have, you know, 3 melee, and it's just like bad to bring more on the boss. You just want as much range as possible. That like you're benching like one of your better players just because they play the wrong type of DPS. Like that just felt wrong. So I'm glad that that's mostly gone away. Um, the one thing I would say is I think Blizzard doing this is good and like it's just good for the game in general. But I would also be careful with still needing either certain numbers of ranged or melee, or especially an even number or an odd number of ranged or melee, because we ran into an example on Sludgefist this last week, was that we had an odd number of melee, and then we had the chains go out on Sludgefist, and I got paired as a melee, and I'm on a. Luckily, I was a BM hunter, so like it was actually relatively easy for me to go into melee and deal with that. But yeah, that was a scenario where, and granted, that's something that you like figured out after a pull or two, but it does still lead you in that weird situation where like you want to have this person in, but because you need an even number of melee, like they have to sit kind of thing. Like I think avoiding that stuff where possible. Like chains is a cool mechanic. There's probably not a really great way to avoid having to have like an even number of melee or ranged or something on that fight without just making like if you have an odd number of each that like the one melee and the one range just don't get paired with anybody, which then it feels like kind of avoiding that mechanic, which isn't the intention of that. So it's probably unavoidable in some spots, but yeah, just being aware of that would be good in the future. But it was funny, so
Yeah, I also experienced it being tied to our Rip Paladin in Melee and becoming Melee for a bit. That was fun. But other things that they're changing, let's think. So they are changing consumables that we have to have less of those. Thank goodness. I'm
yes,
so
everyone liked that.
yeah, the flask, the oil, the augment rune, the food buff, the armor kit, all of the above, just a lot of individual purchases to the point that when I moved my priest over to Raveth Infernum, I brought what I felt like was a good sum of gold, and then I went through it a lot faster than I thought I would. And I was sitting there with 2,000 gold left, and I was, arguing, do I vendor some of this gear I might actually consider using down the line for some niche scenario just so I can have the gold to buy something. I don't know. Just an odd concept. I like that they gave professions more of a meaning in this patch by giving them something to make, but what you ended up seeing was the margins for it were so low because everybody needed it that it wasn't even all that worth making. You had guilds making it for themselves more frequently. On top of that, they're also changing how professions work next expansion. So I'm all good with that. Thank goodness, less consumables.
Yep. And I
Um,
like that professions are going to be hopefully more meaningful and less just like you make this because you have to, and everyone needs 500 of them at the end. Like,
yeah, I
I don't
was
want to craft 500 of these things, you know?
Yeah, well, I was talking to my my tank friend that I'm kind of teaching him how to play the game a bit more because he's interested in Mythic Plus, which we'll touch on in a minute. But um, it's funny because we started to bring up the concept of professions, and I explained like how a legendary works in this patch and all that, and how professions are going to have this big change next expansion. And he was like, "Oh, okay, so what is it?" And I explained that you're gonna have people that are supposed to be unique to crafting pants really well or something like that. And he asked me, he said, "Okay, so how does that differ from right now?" And I kind of had this moment where I was like, "Well, I don't think it does. And I don't know if that's a good thing or not, but I got to see how it plays out first."
Well, I think the upfront cost of doing that will hopefully be lower, and it's like you can still craft the stuff, but it's just you're going to be like less efficient at it or something. Maybe it'll still have its own problems. I don't know. I don't think they've got the professions like fully figured out yet. Um, but they seem to have a vision for it. And so I'm kind of just like along for the ride like, well, I
Yes,
hope that
yes.
works out. But I don't really understand it yet, but I hope it works out.
Yeah.
Economics is too complicated for me.
Well, I had a very small stint in focusing on professions in the very end BFA when I was returning, just because it was something that friends were doing and they were interested in the concept of gold making. And I remember being an alchemist and crafting potions, something like that, or flasks of the like. And when you would transmute, I think is what it was, additional potions or something like that. Like you were
Hmm.
making one and you just got more of them. That was a
Yep.
really good feeling. And you can tell that's trying what they're trying to capture when they're developing these new professions. They want that aspect of it. They want the if you want to craft faster, like half craft speed or something like that, you might be able to do that. If you want there for it to be a chance that like it does the equivalent of Titan forging, I'm a little scared when I heard that, like that you could craft something that just has better eye level. Let's see how far they take that, right? But I don't know.
Hopefully not better than Mythic Raid gear.
Oh yeah, I'm interested in how it goes though. Let's see what happens first.
Yeah.
Um, well, we've strayed from the we've strayed from the interview, but taking it back on track with what they were talking about after that was Mythic Plus. So let's see. The things they touched on were how it was something that was important to Max was this concept of having, what if there's a really good dungeon in the um, first season? Let's just say Mist is an amazing dungeon that everybody loves, and that comes out in the first patch. Well, it's gonna feel real bad to lose that in the second patch. But the way Ian touched on it was they've got their idea of what they want to do for season 1 and 2. After that, if there were good dungeons, it's not out of the realm of possibility for them to revisit it for season 3 or something like that. Even though they also mentioned when they were looking at dungeons to bring back that they wouldn't be looking at I think they said it was Battlelands and BFA were dungeons they weren't really interested in, whereas Legion and back were ones that they were. So
Yeah, I think
yeah.
mainly Mists, Warlords, and Legion were the main three that they were looking.
Yeah. So again, see how it plays out. It'll be really interesting to see how this large shift in gear occurs because we've been used to having our unbound changeling or something of the like that when the raid tier changed, the raid gear changed, that was the big change, not your entire gearing. So now, as we experience in season 4, the Mechagon rings returning, that's something that you definitely have to have in going into season 1 of Dragonflight. It'll be interesting because it's going to be the actual tier mix, mix and matched with whatever the dungeons loot pools were and how you viewed that gear as opposed to just the raid itself. I don't know how I feel about that just yet, but
Um, I think actually Shadowlands maybe was a bit of a maybe it was the outlier in terms of history, where I think most of the time the raid trinkets were usually better, almost universally, and stuff like that, where you wouldn't be using the same trinket multiple seasons in a row because it would be the new raid trinket kind of thing. Um, and I think Shadowlands has maybe been the actual departure from that, where you had Mythic Plus or even open world trinkets. I remember using the Instructor's Divine Bell or the Wakener's
oh yeah.
Frond or whatever for multiple seasons when those were just world quests or like mission table things. Um, and so I think that's not entirely uh like never happened before in history. Like we had stuff like the Arcano Crystal from Legion is kind of famous or whatever. That was also from a world boss. Um, and that also part of the reason that was so good was it could Titan Forge from the world boss too, and so uh but it was good at like even the baseline item level kind of thing. But it's because it was kind of the IQD or whatever, where it basically just gave so much stats um that it was just better than like all the other trinkets kind of just by nature or whatever. Anyway, but the point is I think most of the time using the same loot multiple seasons in a row from Mythic Plus has not been a thing, and that's kind of been unusual in Shadowlands. So uh it feels more normal that you would change things up every season, so I don't think the loot will be as much of a concern. It might be a weird issue where they'll have to balance the loot pools that they choose better though, because depending on which dungeons are in and which ones are out, like you need a certain amount of each type of weapon to be able to drop and like all the different armor slots and all that type of stuff. So it'll probably just require a bit more tweaking and like kind of spreadsheet, making sure all the checkboxes are filled on their end. But other than that, should be fine. I think overall, I'm not certain that I like changing the dungeons every season. Like I said, I think keeping like 2 dungeons that you're used to is a good baseline that you can go in and like, okay, I can at least do those on a 15 or whatever and get my vault keys done for the week or whatever, and then I can then spend the rest of my time learning these 6 new ones kind of thing. I don't know that I like changing all the dungeons every season, personally, but we'll find out. Maybe I'll warm up to it. Um, so I think I'll maybe like season 3 and season 4 of Dragonflight better because I'll know the dungeons mostly by that point. Um, and maybe it's helped a little bit by bringing some of the old dungeons back as part of the earlier season 1 and season 2 pool. So I don't know. We'll see how it works out, but I'm I'm pretty optimistic. I don't think it necessarily comes with problems too much. I think it's more just like it requires them to adjust things.
Yeah, I agree. Have to see how it kind of plays out. Um, but then among Mythic Plus, the whole loot concept, they touch on that in the interview, how they want to bridge the gap because right now rating is superior, um, and pretty clearly with good reason. But they touched on, maybe if you have a full vault, that they'll offer you like mythic end boss eye level loot or something like that. I don't know how I feel about that personally, but I do like the concept of at least rewarding mythic plus, whether it's by a certain key level or something like that, because it's something that they could do where there's like a large gap and then all the way up to something like a 25 ends up rewarding the equivalent 311 gear, but then you have the problem of it being farmable, and I think that was something that they kind of tested unintentionally this patch, or maybe they did so knowingly, which props to them. But you had the heroic raid out, and you had the Valor uncapped. So if you really, really wanted to, basically day one, you go in and get loot that was the equivalent of heroic end boss eye level just from doing dungeons, just from farming to get Valor, and be comfortable with that. It was a very odd concept. Um, I liked the fact, like, I know that it would work for a season 4 equivalent. I'm of the opinion that it definitely would not work in a main season. You kind of need to spread out your gearing, and they're not wrong. Without the dinar system, I feel like they would have killed heroic raiding. It would have been one of those things where it's like, yeah, we could just go back and do those old raids for loot that isn't necessarily all that good. Besides some unique trinkets, like maybe you want the hymnal from Sire. You can't get that from a dungeon, right? So I I like the idea of rewarding high end Mythic Plus. I like that it's on their radar. I very much want to hear their concepts before actually seeing it implemented.
Yeah, so I have two main things with this. The first is that I agree that like Mythic Plus being rewarded higher is probably like just good, and I'm supportive of that. My the thing I would prefer is if more of her raid like gearing was primarily almost entirely from raid, and more of Mythic Plus gearing could be entirely from Mythic Plus, and they could be separate. And you could do both, and they would benefit you in some way or whatever. But it would be like kind of similar to how there's the item level of the item, and then there's PvP item level. Is that you could get, for example, a 298 Mythic Plus item, and that's 298 when you're in raid. But when you're in Mythic Plus, it goes up to like 311, for example. Um, and that could be a way to just make them feel like they don't have to raid to do Mythic Plus, and that raiders don't have to do Mythic Plus to do raid as much. I think if you only want to do one or the other, I think that's perfectly valid and should be like you should only have to do raid if only you want to raid. Like that just makes sense, you know. Um, they don't make raiders do PvP really to do raid. That clearly doesn't make sense. Well, it's similar for Mythic Plus. I think what you said about heroic raid and uncapped valor is very accurate. I think Dratnos had a really good suggestion for this, which was currently you had the weird situation where with the cap was more so the actual base item you had, and then the valor amount that you had access to, for example. So you could farm the base item in the first week entirely if you wanted to. You could do 50 runs of every dungeon, and you could farm them on plus twos and you could get the base item. But then your limiting factor, or on plus 15s, so it doesn't really matter. But once you had the base item, then you were limited to only upgrading like one of those items per week because you only had like 750 valor each week or whatever. Where Dratnos' suggestion was kind of a mix of the two scenarios, where you had uncapped valor, um, and so you could upgrade all the pieces on the base items, but you were capped on the level you could upgrade them to. So rather than being able after 3 weeks to upgrade an item to 12 out of 12, let's say the first week the cap was like 6 out of 12, and then each reset, each week after, that cap would go up by one. So like you would still have uncapped valor, but you would start out with all your mythic plus pieces that you could farm infinitely being 6 out of 12 upgradable, whatever item level that is. I don't know, let's say it's 278 for right now. It might not be that, but whatever it is. and then the next week it would be 7 out of 12, and then they go up to like 288 or whatever, 281, something like that. And then the next week it's 8 out of 12, and then 9 out of 12, and then 10 out of 12, and then 11 out of 12, and then 12 out of 12. And you're upgrading like the whole, you're upgrading it evenly across the board rather than like one item to 12 out of 12 and the other item is sitting at, whatever the cap is, 9 out of 12, and these other items are sitting at 9. You upgrade them all kind of more evenly. I thought that was a really good kind of compromise of the two systems where it feels bad that you're limited on Valor a lot of times in other seasons, and in this season, it felt bad that you're eliminating the purpose of Heroic Raid after the first week, or even earlier, almost within the first week, where that compromise system kind of like Heroic Raid has purpose for the first early weeks of the season still, but after, 4 to 6 weeks or something, yeah, if you wanted to spam Mythic Plus and get Infinite Valor and upgrade all your slots to above heroic item level, if you were primarily or only focused on Mythic Plus at that point, yeah, there's no real reason for you to do heroic raid at that point. Like, it's been 6 weeks into the season by that point. Sure, why not? I thought that was a really good suggestion, so I wanted to just echo that here and bring it up, see what you thought.
Yeah, no, I love Dratnos' idea. I think that'd be really cool. The one thing that I didn't like that you mentioned was actually one of the first things you said about how if what you want is raid loot, that you could just raid. I think that we are blind to the fact that Mythic Plus has been providing such good loot outside of that because you can full clear heroic and get 1 or 2 pieces, and they might not even be the pieces
Right.
that you want or need. And the gearing of that works over the course of a season because you have Mythic Plus to supplement it, and the whole
Yeah,
concept
you
that
would.
they're both PvE, so it's like a little weird the way that
Right.
PvP has those item levels scaling depending on if you're in the content or not. I but I agree with you that like the current state of things isn't optimal, even if we're just taking small baby steps towards something that's better. I'd be interested in seeing that implemented.
Yeah,
So
I think something as basic as like if you clear a plus 25 in that week or whatever, that one of your Great Vault slots turns into like a 311 piece. I think that'd be still an upgrade from where we are now. I just would rather it, like, to me that makes it feel like plus 25s are now the new plus
yep.
15 for
Yep.
raiders almost. And I don't want to get that scenario. So I was trying to like say, can we do that? But also it would also require somehow changing the way raid looting works with like either dinars or the upgrade tokens or a combination of both or some new bonus roll coin system. Who knows? Whatever. It would require tuning the raid loot adjusting at the same time so that like the 25s aren't mandatory basically
Yeah.
in some way. So that's, yeah, there's there's probably not a very clean way to do it. All these things kind of interact with each other, and so it gets messy real quick when you're having to change one thing over here, but it affects all these other 5 different things branching off of it in these other weird little aspects. And so you have to change, 10 or 20 things at once instead of just the one change that you're wanting to make. So yeah, it gets complicated, but
Yeah, I like that the community is developing ideas, and by community I mean Dratnos. So I kind of want to see their. I would be interested in a Blizzard response about this, but obviously we won't see it. We'll just see that in concepts going forward. Who knows? I'm fine if Dragonflight Season 1 doesn't take any of these big leaps. Let them focus on some other things like
yeah,
talent trees, which they touched on in the interview, where you've got druids and priests that have not seen much of an update. I personally think that's entirely reasonable given what's actually happening on the back end, where you have the developer that stopped working on WoW, quit, whatever it was, moved on to a different company, who knows, that is no longer working on those. The whole power word update meme, yeah, I think it's funny, but I, as someone that is currently also playing Priest, I am almost happy about it because if that means that a lot of the other class developers get to take a look at Priest and provide all of their good inputs they've had from the iterations of their own trees, that could speed through the necessary changes for some of these two classes. I don't know. I That also could mean that they do a really poor job at it and they keep arguing about what's best. I don't know, but I want to see what is to come. But I'm glad that they addressed it. That at least you heard the words druid and priest when talent trees were mentioned.
yes. Yeah, I think there's kind of two separate issues here, which are kind of getting conflated together, which is the actual amount of updates and changes, which clearly it's been basically zero for those two classes. Like, and that's not it's not maybe ideal from like a player perspective, but I think is also pretty understandable and not necessarily like the doomer like end of the world situation that some people maybe think it is. Because I think everyone pretty much expects those classes are clearly, if they need updates, which I think they do, they're going to receive those updates before the game comes out. Like they're gonna get fixed eventually. It's just not in the immediate instant right now, um, and that's understandable. They maybe probably can't do everything at once, so that's understandable. The other issue I think is the communication of the lack of changes, or rather, I think just the lack of communication in general. And I think that's what uh, Ian addressed in the interview, saying like, "Yeah, we could have been better about this. We said Power Word update, and then ghosted you for like another month or two, and
Hmm.
like that's not ideal." So, saying that like, yeah, that's a place where we should do better, and say like, "Hey, we cast Power Word update. We still are probably not going to have anything to actually, you know, give you guys for changes for another like 2 weeks, and then every 2 weeks at least give an update and say, sorry guys, it's going to be another 2 weeks. We're focusing on these other things for now. Rest assured we'll get to you and we'll make sure that you're in a good place like before Dragonflight. Like it doesn't take more than probably 5 or 10 minutes to just write up that couple sentences every 2 weeks. It's I think not too much of the community to ask, and I think Blizzard agrees that like yeah, that's pretty reasonable to ask for, and is kind of just like good, healthy um, communication between people that you don't want to breed animosity for any real reason. And if you can just keep people understanding, just you don't have to lie, just tell them the truth. Like people
Well,
are pretty understanding most of the time. I feel like some people
I
are never going to be reasonable, and that is also a thing. And like I'm sure they're aware of that, but more so than we could ever probably imagine. So that's also a thing. But yeah. So anyway, but I think his response was good, and yeah, I'm not like worried for druids and priests. I think they'll just have to be patient, and I'm glad that they're being heard that like yeah, their communication could probably use some work, but I think they'll be okay. And I think Blizzard is aware that they communication is always something that can be improved to some extent. So
yeah. And I mean, on top of it, that's their only system is the talent trees. Like he touched on in the interview, like they finished one thing in Shadowlands, and they had these other systems to turn to. So I'm loving this concept of no systems, just make it the base game as good as it can be. Let's iterate from the ground up. Talent trees weren't working. We fix those in this patch or this expansion, and then we go from there. I love that, and I love that. You know, the community has had such an involvement in the talent trees as we've seen. Max did a great job of kind of bridging that gap. He saw that it was needed. He had Blizzard contacts that made it almost heard essentially. So I'm glad. And you saw the talent tree developers in his chat or in the class discords
yes,
shouting about it.
yep.
A couple of class discords, avoid them like fire, please. But I can't tell you which ones, otherwise I'm biased. But that whole concept,
If
like
if you know, you know. Let's
if you
just
know, you know.
leave it
But
at that.
um, and then minor thing they touched on, dragon riding. It's cool, and Max liked it, and it's something that I think we will all come to enjoy the more that we do it. Let's not lose that going forward, and they agree. They want to develop a system that's going to stick around. I understand why after developing all these systems that don't, and they just need to throw away, but it'll be odd to see how normal flying feels compared to dragon riding. How does that shape the future of WoW? I don't know, but it sounds like it's important to them that if it's a good enough system, they want to keep it around. And I don't think it's all that terrible that we could start to experience it kind of the way that flying was introduced in BC, right? I think that's when it was introduced. Um,
Burning Crusade, yeah.
yeah, so they're basically saying this might be a thing that's as big a staple as flying, and I'm okay with that.
I
See it.
hot take. Dragon riding is going to be like the fourth endgame pillar of WoW. Like there's Mythic
Oh
Plus,
no.
there's PvP, there's raiding, and then there's like your dragon riding speedruns, and like that's where I'm gonna be.
Oh,
That's my jam right there.
we've we've touched on it
We've lost him,
already. Yeah, we've
and
lost we
so
lost Rio. He's not doing his dungeons. He's busy
yep.
just flying the courses
Sorry
again.
guys, can't do my 15 this week. I'm doing my 300th, grinding of this dragon riding gold challenge mode time. Yep.
Yeah. Um, I I don't know. We'll have to see how it goes, but
Give me my
what's
311 item level from my world
oh
record time,
no,
please.
no, no, no.
Okay, I'm not going that far.
That yeah. But I think what's gonna be pretty cool is Break has already started talking about it amongst each other that they did an M0 tournament where right when the expansion for Shadowlands dropped, and they got max level, they were doing their M0s, they had a
This
race
is
for
in
them.
the first weeks of an expansion before Mythic
Yeah.
Plus
Yeah.
releases. Yeah,
And
just to give context to people who might not know.
right. Cool concept. Neither of us were in the group at the time, so it'd be kind of cool. Like they had a whole caster desk equivalent, not boost or anything, but you know what I'm saying. And so they're considering doing that on the M0 tournament, but on top of that, also doing a dragon riding contest where people have had minimal to no experience with it and seeing how people perform. I think that could be just hilarious, just for the fun of it.
Absolutely.
So
I can't wait to
honestly,
slam face first into a tree.
yeah, I'm going to really, really struggle with not doing well with it. That's all I have to say. I
Oh,
I
I
like to
see.
do well.
Okay.
So seeing
So
yeah.
seeing Rio above you on the leaderboard is going to make you also lose your life to it, is what you're saying.
Yes, yes it will, unfortunately.
And we're not
Um
going to touch on the assumption that Rio's ahead you on the leaderboard because
it's
that's a assumed fact at this point, obviously.
no, 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 not yet. But it's gonna be awful because I'm gonna
I'm
be at
building
that
the
point.
storylines.
Yeah, yeah, but I'm gonna be at that point where I'm saying to myself, dang, I wanna level this class so I can have it in Dragonflight, but I
Oh,
wanna get
that's
good
true.
at dragon riding.
Yeah, I do also want to play Alts and Dragonflight.
Yeah.
Can I gain XP on characters for doing dragon riding?
Gain XP. That's wow. That's
I'm
like
just
taking Torghast to a whole new level. I don't
I
know
I think if Torghast gave XP from the start, people probably wouldn't have hated it as much, to be fair.
as much. Yeah, probably
As
still
much.
some, but
Probably you can't escape some of the it's unescapable.
it
That's
would
what
have
it
just
is.
become is Torghast a faster way to level versus
Yeah,
questing or dungeons? Who
that's
knows?
true. It is always a uh least whatever difficulty kind of efficiency thing.
Yeah, but then I think the most important part of the entire interview came right at the end, and I'm probably an idiot for saying that because there definitely were very important topics mentioned, but to kind of end it all, they acknowledged the start of the holidays and the raid release and how that could affect people. Um, I, crazy, crazy to see. I'm knowing that the expansion is most likely to come out based on their schedule towards the end of November or start of December. That does put the raid weeks very, very close to the holidays again. And I know that we've kind of already started to touch on it. You were going off on people on Twitter. I kind of want to give you the floor to mention some of those things first. So go
Okay.
ahead.
Well, okay. I think it's actually been less of an issue recently, and maybe it's just because the interview thing happened. I don't know. But at the start, when this was kind of being discussed on like the first like day or two after the leak date came out and things like that, which I don't know if we really want to touch on. It might be true, it might be not. Who knows? Um, is that people are saying like, oh, it only affects the race to world first people and like the top 1% of again these like elitist sea eagles and things like that. So I took a look and there was like I forget the number. I it's in a tweet somewhere. It was like somewhere between like 500 and 800 somewhere in there. Like different guilds had gotten their kill on normal mode Council of Blood. I just chose like a random middle of the tier boss on normal mode as like the most casual kind of like generic like middle of the road what could you expect? And like yeah, like 500 or 800 guilds somewhere in there got their first kill of that boss during the week of December 25th or whatever in that 7-day period um for that week. In because Castle Nathria released also in like a similar time frame around the holidays or whatever. And so it clearly was not like raiding over the holidays only affects these like top 10 guilds in the world or whatever. It's like it affects these people that there's still however many hundreds of guilds raiding over the holidays like and were they raiding with their full roster? Probably not, but who knows, whatever. And so it clearly affects basically everyone playing the game. That was kind of the point that I was trying to make. Um, rather than And it's not just an issue of like it's us versus the rest world first people of like should it release at this time, should it not? It's just kind of like, well, it affects everybody. So it's not, you know, us versus them. It's just like, well, is it good for you? Is it good for me? Is it bad for you? Is it bad for me? Like, I just think it's not ideal in general, but it's probably not really realistically going to change based on what the community feels in the first place. It's just going to end up whatever it ends up as. Um, I also looked because then people were like, well, that's the whole week. And then so what about just the 3 days of like the 24th, 25th, and 26th or something? So I looked at those 3 days and it was like, still, it was like a few hundred guilds. And so it was like, people are still rating on those 3 days even. So yeah. Personally, I would prefer it not be released around the holidays. I'm also busy around the holidays most of the time, and especially this year I will be. Um, and I don't like missing early weeks of an expansion and early weeks of a raid. Like even if the raid didn't release, missing those first early weeks of M0s and learning all the dungeons with everybody else and like um, doing all the early like achievement stuff and like getting all of the reputations going and all this stuff, you just get so behind that I feel like it's not really fun if you're not there along for the whole experience kind of. But the start of an expansions are just kind of a unique special time for like the first month or two anyway, and missing any of it just kind of feels bad, so I'd rather not miss as much of it as possible. So that's kind of my general feelings on it. But like I said, realistically what the community feels like Blizzard already probably is well aware. They've done this in the past already, and so it's probably not going to change. If that's what they decided on, that's what they decided on, and it's just going to end up that way, and we just deal with it. But
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because you touched on the idea of taking a break, and I'm sure that affects everybody differently. So I wonder, because when you see an expansion release, you see the subscriber count just shoot right up, right? Like you're gonna have plenty of apps to guilds, people returning from old expansions, what have you, right? But the the interesting aspect is that drop off that happens after an expansion.
I was
It's
going to say,
always
you also have a lot of people that think they're going to love the expansion, and then they realize after a month or two that they're like, actually, I'm out.
yeah, yes, you have a drop off. So if you do this over a holiday, does that increase the number of players dropping off because they have to take time away and then they feel like they're too far behind? Like,
Mhm.
okay, good example is the Diablo season came out. I don't ever play Diablo seasons. I would have actually given it a thought if two things weren't true. One, I wasn't visiting family this weekend, and then on top of that, um, that it was like a relatively good push week to just do some keys. I probably would have tried it. But now it's like, well, I'm not gonna do it now. Like it people are too far ahead and it's not the same feeling as starting at the same time as everybody. And I know that it's not necessarily going to be released on Christmas dang day or something like that, right? But
Right, right.
but you are going to have a large portion of the gearing and the important aspects coming out right about the same time. So um, it- they led into a very, very important question that was not a promise, that was just a concept they wanted to ask the
Hypothetical,
community.
yeah.
Yeah, very hypothetical. Do they release normal, heroic, and mythic all on the same day? I was
I,
as flabbergasted as Max when the question
yeah.
was asked. How about you?
I also was kind of like, oh, this is something I never even considered would be an option that they would consider or that I would have expected. And so I was also like, huh. I think my initial impression is that I think it comes with more problems than benefits, but I'm not 100% certain on that, one way or the other. I feel like either way would be fine. Like, neither one is gonna, like, ruin the tier or anything. Like, after a couple weeks, it probably won't matter realistically one way or the other. But yeah, I don't know if it puts more pressure on the early weeks or less pressure on the early weeks, but then it's like it also kind of in a similar way to the dinars and like the upgrade tokens is like is it just rewarding the guilds that do better earliest on and get further in the raids like even more than they already are by doing that? Like I don't know. It just comes with so many like questions and different ways that you could think about it and um similar to the issue that we've brought up. This was like on one of our first episodes or two, where like we didn't really kill heroic jailer hardly at all, and I'm wondering like is it going to be the point now where because you can start into mythic earlier that you don't kill the heroic end bosses as much again, and then not only do you have that issue on heroic jailer, but you maybe also have that issue on heroic Ragolon and Lords of Dread, and then you're going into like 3 end bosses or near end bosses, end of tier bosses on mythic that like you've never really killed on heroic more than like twice, and like so then that issue becomes more than just one boss. It's like multiplied on 3 bosses, and that makes those bosses appear so much more extra difficult than they normally would be in a regular tier, and like so many different factors for Max and like the race to world first perspective. He was like, maybe that means they sell heroic earlier or something, or they don't need to make mirror characters or like all these different things, which is their own factor that doesn't come into play for us at all. Um, which I don't think Blizzard should be making changes only for the race to world first people. I think they're doing this change primarily for the benefit or the consideration of the hundreds or thousands of guilds um, that progress the raids quote unquote normally if the race to world first guilds are the abnormal ones. Um, so yeah, I don't know whether it's good or bad. I think it's just kind of different, and I don't know. Maybe it's worth trying just to have a different thing and see how it goes. Maybe I don't know. I don't feel like it'll be catastrophically bad, so maybe that's just a good enough reason to try it once. Who knows?
Yeah, I think budgeting time is the biggest thing that I'm thinking about, obviously, as an
Yeah,
officer, but just the concept of like, well, you're gonna have people that have different opinions. You're gonna have people that want to just push Mythic to see how difficult it could possibly be, and just like spend those hours wiping to get that early, I don't know, Eye of the Jailer equivalent kill. Who
right.
knows, right? Or you're gonna want the people that want to clear bosses because they'll be a bit easier, even if they take a bit more time to kill than a typical heroic clear, but you'll get more done. And you also touch on that concept of like pulling an end boss without pulling it on heroic all that much or at all. There was an anecdote where a guildie of ours, Sama, he was raiding in the other group Infernum with me, and we killed Mythic Jailer, and he got the ahead of the curve achievement for killing it. It's just like one of those things like, oh, okay. So is that gonna be realistic for us? I don't know.
Well, my thing is like, okay, what you're saying with people are going to evaluate the worth of the time differently or whatever, either from just officers in general or just like the whole, each individual person on the raid team in general. Is that too different from when like the first week of Mythic releases already, and it's just like that issue already exists in the second week of the raid? We're just moving that to like the first week, and like we already kind of deal with that. I feel like on the second week, and it's not that big of an issue, but it's also like you also kind of know by that point roughly how much time heroic will take you because you spent the week in doing it already, and so then you're just having to guess of like one difficulty of like how long mythic will take you and how far you could get into mythic. Whereas and you'll also have more data because you'll see all the guilds above and below you how far they got into heroic, whether they got ahead of you or not as far as you, and how much time they spent. And then most of them that are ahead of you in heroic week or whatever probably then go into mythic, and you can get an idea of mythic as well a little bit ahead of where you are. Whereas if they're all released at once, you don't have as much clear where you can be like, well, this guild got 3 bosses into mythic but they skipped clearing heroic entirely, so like does that mean that we could clear heroic and then get 2 bosses or just 1 boss? Like you're playing all this weird math equalizing game on the scales of like, does this equal this? But this like it's just this huge weird algebra equation, and it just gets really complicated. That I feel like it's adding so many more variables to stuff that, um, yeah,
yeah,
might make it more of a headache than usual. So,
like the early shift syndrome. The the
oh
concept that like
yeah,
you spend a lot of time. Yeah, you can kill a boss, but is it really worth it? So I don't know. I think it'd be fun. I think it definitely would accelerate the date
that's
that
true.
the
I didn't
world.
even think of that. Like so many guilds could now go for quote unquote world first on like the first mythic boss like that.
Yeah,
That's
so
actually really funny.
just so everybody understands, in Sepulchre, the first ones, the early shift was a guild that got world first Vigilant Guardian when it was incredibly difficult, and you had all of the normal world first guilds just choosing to do heroic because it just made more sense. You wanted tier sets and all that, and
Yep.
and that's the other thing is like we're supposed to have tier sets for Dragonflight, so even if they are released on the same day, do we just see another Sepulcher equivalent where people are just intending to clear Heroic just for the sake of getting those tier sets? I don't know. I couldn't tell you. I gotta see how it plays out.
Well,
But
and then also then it's like, well, then you want to clear both heroic and normal, but then you're also putting like your normal clear in fighting for your time of your mythic clear, and like that's kind of weird
yeah,
because like the early mythic bosses probably don't have the tier tokens. So yeah, it's just I think I would prefer to not do it and just keep it the way it is with the 1 week delay, but
yeah,
I don't know,
because
man.
what else would it affect? It would probably uh accelerate the date at the world first last boss kill. I would almost expect, right? Um, while gear is still needed, the access to the mythic raid sooner must just accelerate it in some regards. Certainly, right? You,
Yeah, I think it means the raid on mythic, for example, gets tuned at a slightly lower item level compared to what it normally would be at,
yeah,
because guilds won't go in having had a week, almost now 2 weeks of heroic normal clears, and mythic plus to some extent, and a great vault going into mythic. Right? They'll have a
yeah.
lot less gear going in, basically. So
Well, and slight spoilers about the next raid for anybody listening, but
we don't know
uh,
if the great vault is returning then,
well,
but we're
oh,
assuming it mostly is to some way.
well, my point was actually more about it's going to be an eight boss raid, and this whole concept of um having some form of borrowed power to help you through it, right? You had domination sockets in Sanctum and Sepulchre, the first ones. You kind of got that boost from the double legendary, but that was and tier sets, but that was very very early into the tier. So what happens with a new tier that they make it still go fast? Do they make it so it's tuned for you to kill it with less gear? So by the time that you do get geared, you are the max eye level. Maybe your average item level equates to that of a 15 would, right? That a 15 would drop in your vault. Are you more comfortably clearing it? Is that their kind of approach? I don't know. I don't think 1 week alone would change enough of that, but I also think it'd be really bad if your Mythic Raid released and you had what happened in Sepulchre, where you want to see the mythic bosses and the guilds pulling mythic bosses and they're just not pulling them. It just doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
And I mean, in turn, that would like lengthen the raid from the start date of Mythic relative to the other start date of Mythic. I know I explained that poorly, but I don't know. I kind of would be interested to see if they did that. I would personally like that if they did release all three together, which isn't my ideal scenario, like you said. But if they did choose to do that, make it so that the Mythic raid is just a little bit easier relative to the eye level you go in with. Make it
Yes.
make it reasonable to okay, we got 184s from Mythic Zero, I think it was, at the start of Shadowlands.
Yeah.
Make it reasonable to pull a boss at 184 eye level, the way it wasn't necessarily before.
It was for like heroic, but not really for mythic, I would
Yeah,
say.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So like, maybe make it somewhat reasonable. I don't know, I, and I wouldn't even mind if they like made the raid um a steep curve where the ladder bosses were tough and you really need the gear to get through them, because you'll get that gear by the time that we get to them, and it makes a really good showing for the world first race, in my mind. But I don't know. What are your thoughts about all that?
Yeah, I think more of the early bosses. Well, I guess no. I was gonna say maybe more of the early bosses should be like that, where they're less. They have a lower gear like entry point requirement kind of thing, and you can like instead of only killing Vigilant Guardian and Skolex with whatever gear that you walked into Sepulchre with, that you could clear, and maybe Dysagnia or something that you could clear like up through Pantheon. Like instead of being 2 or 3 bosses, it was more closer to like 5. Um, but in certain tiers, I do like that some of the harder bosses start earlier as kind of a middle tier point rather than the end. I guess it kind of depends on what the power curve is over the tier, whether you are getting some sort of borrowed power or not, kind of thing. Like I liked Painsmith in Sanctum a lot, and that was relatively early. I even liked Soul Render, which we spent I don't know like 70 something pulls on, um, and he was like the third or fourth boss who did fourth, I guess. Um, I liked that as kind of like a mid. Like he required some prog over a couple nights, and um, he didn't just like fall over with the gear that we went in there with, kind of thing. So, yeah, I don't know. I guess it just depends on the raid, but
Yeah, yeah. Let's kind of see how it plays out. If they choose to go down that path,
I'm also curious because I think mostly the first raid, like you said, will have the talent trees and the tier sets. I'm curious for the second and third raid of the expansion, or just kind of the second patch, the third patch. What if anything will be added onto that? Will it just stay? You have your talent tree, and you get a new tier set bonus that's maybe more powerful. Like the first tier bonus is maybe like 5 to 8% DPS, and the next one is like 10 to 12%, and the one after that is like 15 to 20% range of DPS increase. And so it's like you obviously want to use the new tier bonus just because it is strictly better, and that's the way that they'll power curve stuff, because that's how they've kind of had to do that in the past. Just to make sure that you're not like, I'm in Sepulcher and I'm using the Castle Nathria tier set bonus because
yeah,
it's just better, right? So they kind of had to do that effectively in the past. Or are they gonna do another somehow system power increase that's not a tier set bonus, but isn't borrowed power, I think, is their goal. So like it's gonna have to be something that they can carry forward. But I don't know what that would be, what it would look like. I don't think they're gonna announce it until like the patch announcement, basically, until it's already been figured out. So I'm just curious what their solution to that problem kind of is. Because I'm not sure, I still think we do kind of need a tiny bit of borrowed power to an extent. I just think tying it to gear most of the time is better than it being like some weird other system and having some weird other requirements like rep or just grinding dailies or killing rares for hours a day and like all that type of stuff. I think tying it to like you go in the raid and you kill gear and your borrowed power is tied to you killing the raid bosses and getting the gear from the raid bosses. Like that makes a lot more sense to me. And it feels a lot better, I think, as a progression curve or whatever, as a player gearing up and completing, getting further in the raid and stuff. But I'm just not sure what other form it will take in this new world of like not trying to get away from the borrowed power stuff and into more of a evergreen type of thing.
yeah. And um, touching on the concept of the tier sets, something that's important to me is that we have. I personally would be frustrated if patch 10.1 contained a if patch 10.1 contained a different tier set than 10.0, I would not be very happy. I liked the fact that, and I know it was a shortened season, but we rolled from 9.3 into 9.4, or well, I'm sorry, 9.25 into 9.27, right? But that we kept the same tier set, and it was more just an eye level increase, and we got to see that tier set and how it applied in a different raid. I like the concept that they want to think of tier sets, but let's thin them out and make them better as opposed to the way that they're doing it with dungeons and just kind of throw everything and see what works for that given season.
Yeah, overall, I'm excited. I'm interested to see what they come up with. I think Dragonflight is looking pretty good, and I'm definitely excited the more I hear them talk about stuff. I feel like they have a very good philosophy going in this time, where I disagreed with a lot of their philosophies going into Shadowlands, or at least I thought they had good parts, but they also had some glaring flaws, bad parts. And Dragonflight, I feel like, has a lot of the good parts, and so far, I'm not really seeing any kind of fatal flaw with a lot of their philosophy stuff. I feel like a lot of it has good ideas behind the core of it, and it's just like how they want to expand on that into whatever they create out of it. And so I'm curious as to what those end up being, basically. So,
Yeah. The motto of this particular podcast episode has been let's kind of just see how it goes. So that's how
yep,
I'll end it. Let's see how it goes.
perfect.